All right, everybody. Back here with another live stream, doing the reading hour again. Just going to take another second for the Instagram to catch up, and then I will get started. All right, so picking right back up on the Gladio book, the last paragraph I had read was copies of these files, some of which were as thick as dictionaries, were sent to the Vatican and to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. And then there was a section, the last paragraph was called Nude Photos of John Paul II. As the new leader of P2, this is the Masonic Lodge Propaganda Due, Jelly continued to amass telling documents not only on leftist officials but also members of his lodge. When a recruit joined the order, he was obliged to demonstrate his loyalty by conveying to Jelly documents that would compromise not only himself and his family, but also other possible candidates. When these potential candidates were confronted with the evidence of their misdeeds, they generally caved in and submitted to the initiation rite without a word of protest. So again, just in these last two sentences, and I mentioned it last time, it's not quite clear whether it's like they're saying that the recruits had to give over compromising info on themselves, but then also were presented with that same info as if the organization got it through some other means and then showed it to them, showing their own power and their connections. So, kind of contradictory paragraph here. It's a little confusing, but I'm going to read on, see if it clarifies any more. This proved to be the case with Giorgio Mazzanti, the new president of ENI. Faced with incriminating evidence showing he had accepted huge bribes and payoffs from a pending Saudi oil deal, Mazzanti took the vow of secrecy, joined the elite Masonic Lodge, and handed over to Jelly even more compromising information. Okay, so that's how it works. They get some compromising info on you through the connections that they already have, and then they get you to join by showing you that, and then now they own you. Now, this also makes a lot of sense when you think of how organizations like the CIA, Mossad, the whole Epstein thing, pretty sure I mentioned this before, but it all comes together. It all seems like it's one kind of method that they're using. Eventually, Jelly's files came to contain not only embarrassing material on nearly every prominent Italian government official, but also nude photos of John Paul II next to a swimming pool. While displaying the photos of the naked pontiff, the P2 Grand Master reportedly quipped, quote, "If it's possible to take these photos of the Pope, imagine how easy it is to shoot him." Yeah, this is crazy stuff. These people are like insane clandestine actors. Like these are like the real uh dastardly secret agents that do all these assassinations. Like this is like the stuff they make movies about, but they portray these people favorably when they should portray them as the monsters that they are. So now we're on to chapter 6, the rise of Michele Sindona. So long as the bank invests those uh, drug deposits in overnight money and is able to cover when the deposits are withdrawn, there is no financial threat to the bank other than the peripheral one of perhaps affecting the confidence that people have in it because of known associations with criminals. The fact that a bank does business with criminals, or is even owned by them, is of minor importance to the overseers of the nation's banks. And I guess this is from Paul Homan, Deputy Controller of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, quoted in Penny Lerno's In Banks We Trust. So I don't know if this is like a book or just an article, but you can look that up. Penny Lernoux, Lernaux, In Banks We Trust. In 1957, Michele Sindona attended a mob gathering at the Grand Hotel de Palm in Palermo with such criminal luminaries as Lucky Luciano, Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, Carmine Galante, Frank Costello, Don Giuseppe Genco Russo, the head boss of the Sicilian families, Salvatore Ciascheteddu, or Little Bird Greco, and the La Barbara brothers. Haven't heard of them either. Okay. See, these are all apparently very famous and powerful mobsters. So the 3-day event, which was held from October 3rd to 5th, resulted in the organization of a Sicilian commission that would oversee all aspects of the multi-billion-dollar heroin trade. Okay, so yeah, this is also funny because like I can't remember if it's I'm pretty sure it's Michael Parente who says that like when people accuse you of being a conspiracy theorist because you talk about these actual organizations and the way that they operate, and they'll say things like, "What do you think these people just get together in suits and in rooms and they plot these things out?" It's like, yes, that's exactly what they do. They have like 3-day conferences like this where they get all these powerful heads of mafia organizations along with intelligence agents They may wear suits, they may not, but either way, they turn off the fucking recorders. They don't keep notes of this shit. It's like that scene in The Wire when what's his name? Idris Elba, I can't remember his character's name, but he says to the other guy, he's like, "Are you trying to take notes on a fucking criminal conspiracy here?" Because they were following like the Robert Rules of Order to conduct their meetings with like some semblance of structure. Um, and then one of the kids took that too far and was like trying to take notes. It's like, this is what these people do. These are like well-to-do people. I've been talking in the beginning about how the CIA was comprised of these like wealthy elite bankers and lawyers, and they were the people who were the most interested in upkeeping this Western order and this Western hegemony, or at this time instilling it, basically. But I'll continue here. So, in 1957, Michele Sindona attended a mob gathering. Oh, sorry, that was the last paragraph. So, the Sicilians, according to FBN agent Martin F. Pera, gave the Americans an ultimatum at Palermo. They knew there were a number of rebellious young hoods in America, so they told their bosses, quote, "If you don't deal with us, we'll deal with them." Not having control over narcotics would have put all other rackets at risk, so the Americans had no choice but to go along. Little Bird Greco emerged from the conference as primus inter pares, first among equals. Okay, so they're all equal, but one guy is more equal than others. I see. Literally just like saying it there. The elevation of Greco was prompted by his pivotal role in the narcotics trade. He owned a fleet of ships that sailed under the Honduran flag and, through Frank Coppola, moved heroin to Santo Traficante Jr. in Cuba via food shipments. Remember we had read earlier about how they would like disguise them as fruits. You'd have crates of oranges where half the oranges would just be wax and filled with heroin. But no one benefited from the gathering more than Sindona, who gained complete control of the flow of cash from the mean streets of America's inner cities to the Vatican Bank. Okay, so he's like the head guy. He's like that. Who's the guy in The Dark Knight who's like, I keep all the books? The Appalachian Conference. But the unification of the American mob, which had been brought about by Luciano in 1931, was crumbling. In October 1957, Vito Genovese, still serving as Lucky's underboss, forged an alliance with Carlo Gambino for the execution of Albert Anastasia, the head of the Mangano crime family. Anastasia had ruffled the feathers of Meyer Lansky and Santo Traficante Jr. by attempting to gain control of the lucrative flow of heroin from Havana. 1 month after Anastasia's murder, Genovese provided over the Appalachian Conference, or Appalachian, I guess it's a little different, so, a follow-up American Mafia summit to the event in Palermo, in which he anointed himself, quote, boss of all bosses, capo de tutti capi, appointed Carlo Gambino the new head of the Mangano clan, and ruled that the mob should not be involved in trafficking in narcotics outside of Harlem and other black neighborhoods. So yeah, they had also mentioned earlier, like just through their sheer racism, they thought it was fine to sell drugs to people of color to all these like inner city areas because they didn't care what happened to those people, and they just saw them as like literally a host they could parasite off of and make their money. In the midst of the conference, the Pennsylvania State Police staged a raid that resulted in the arrest of Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, a Gambino Capo regime boss, Joseph Bonanno, and Santo Traficante Jr., the head of the South Florida family and the pivotal mob figure in Cuba. Others in attendance were Stefano Magaddino of Buffalo, Nick Savella of Kansas City, Sam Giancana of Chicago, and representatives from families in Milwaukee, Dallas, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. So like the heads of all the families of like all the major cities in the US, and even some minor cities. The Appalachian Conference was a milestone in the annals of organized crime in America, wiping out previous myths and misunderstandings about La Cosa Nostra, including the statements of J. Edgar Hoover that the Mafia, in fact, did not exist. The raid that caused the breakup of the mob meeting captured national headlines for weeks, infuriating the mafiosi and embarrassing U.S. government officials. So yeah, this has got to be actually bad for all parties involved. It's like everyone but the low-level cops looks awful. The high-level government officials look bad for having either tolerated or not knowing that the mob existed. And then the mob looks bad for getting exposed this badly. The public now knew for the first time that an organized syndicate of mob families controlled the flow of illicit drugs throughout the country. Yeah, that too. So this next section here is Vito's comeuppance. Luciano outraged by the presumption of his underboss and the outcome of the conference, recruited Carlo Gambino to take part in a scheme to clip the wings of Vito Genovese, the self-proclaimed capo of the American Commission. Gambino, at Lucky's insistence, sought out Nelson Cantalopes, a small-time crook serving a stint in Sing Sing. Sorry, I'm just caught on this guy's name, Cantalopes. It's very funny. A small-time crook serving a stint in Sing Sing, and persuaded him by a gift of $100,000 to offer testimony that he had witnessed Genovese making massive drug buys. Cantalopes complied. I mean, for $100,000, why would you not? Yeah, I'll make false testimony, sure. Who cares? In 1958, Genovese and 24 members of his gang were collared for violating the New Narcotics Control Act. At the trial, Cantalopes testified that not only had he witnessed the buys, but that had acted as a courier for Genovese by transporting heroin from Harlem to black communities throughout the country. The jury was reportedly rigged, and based almost entirely on the testimony of Cantalopes, Genovese and his soldiers were sentenced to 15 years in prison. With Genovese tucked away in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Santo Trafficante Jr., upon the occasion of Luciano's death in 1962, became by default the head capo of the international heroin trade. So this is cool too. It's like you can see that when needed, the arm of the justice system can be used for the whims of the mob if they just control every aspect of the trial, the jury. They're able to do that basically. They make up a witness, they just pay him off. Awesome. At 57, he was one of the most effective mob leaders. Avoiding the ostentatious lifestyle of Cadillacs and diamond rings that characterized many of the mafiosi, Trafficante cultivated the austerity of the old Sicilian dons and manifested a self-effacing attitude that contributed to his considerable influence over the Sicilian and American families. So he played it smart. He was like real modest about it, I guess. Despite his prestige among the men of respect, his good sense prevented him from campaigning for a leading position on the mob's national and international commissions. He stayed for the most part in the shadows, thereby becoming the least known and most underestimated leaders of organized crime. Yeah, it's a cool way to do it, I guess. Never thought about how you should operate as a mob head, but that seems to be one method. So the next section here, Michele's rise. The fall of Vito Genovese propelled the rise of Michele Sindona. I thought that's like what we were already talking about. Wasn't that like the previous section was, the rise of Michele Sindona. Oh, it's the chapter head, so. But anyway, the aspiring mob lawyer, with the blessing of his dons Giuseppe Genco Don Carlo's successor, and Lucky Luciano, now developed close ties to the Gambino crime family, which by marriage included the Inzarello and Spatola clans in Sicily. Oh, so they must have had some kind of marriage of like mob royalty, like a prince and princess. It's kind of funny to think of. Aware of Sindona's pivotal position with the CIA and IOR, the Gambinos did not hesitate to take him under their protective wing. Don Michele, they would say, you are the greatest of all Sicilians. Let us help you with your problems. Tell us whom you want killed. Tell us who the bastards are. Yeah, I guess that's one way to ingratiate yourself to the guy. Several weeks after the conference in Palermo, Sindona used mob money and CIA funds to create Fosco AG, a Liechtenstein holding company that became the cornerstone of his financial empire. Through Fosco, he purchased his first bank, the Banca Privata Finanziaria, BPF, in Milan. Founded in 1930 by a fascist ideologist, the BPF served as a conduit for the illegal transfer of funds from Italy for a favored few. Yeah, I mean, pretty much the entire premise of all of this is like secreting funds, drugs, people, all of it to fight communism and to forward the interests of the wealthy business elite, the mafia, drug traffickers, Nazis, Freemasons, and the Vatican, whose interests are all aligned against the communists, against labor workers, against like unions and stuff, against all the liberatory theologies and ideologies. So the BPF now served as a principal means of transferring drug money from the IOR for the purpose of Gladio. William Harvey, the new CIA station chief in Rome, arranged for the financial firms of Sir Jocelyn Hambro, the owner of the Hambros Bank, and David M. Kennedy, chairman of the Continental Illinois Bank in Chicago, to become minority shareholders, with each firm purchasing 22% of the bank's stock. Interesting. Cool stuff. Let's see how much longer I got on this one. Yeah, I got about 5 more minutes on this book, and I'll switch to the next one. So this next section here is strange bedfellows. Sir Jocelyn Hambro and Sindona, by all appearances, were strange bedfellows. The son and heir of one of England's most prestigious merchant banking families, Hambro spent his days hobnobbing with the world's elite. Surely, the peasant from Padai would have been a most unwelcome guest at the Hambro family estate in Kidbrooke Park, Sussex, let alone at the Jockey Club in Newmarket, which is one of Sir Jocelyn's favorite haunts. The mystery of the relationship was compounded by the fact that Sindona was neither an established figure nor a member of the international banking community. Indeed, his major asset at the time of their meeting was a newly created shell company. The sole explanation for the bizarre partnership resides in the long-standing ties of Hambro to the intelligence community. He was one of the founders of the OSS, and his presence on the board of the World Commerce Company, WCC, smacks of complicity in the heroin trade. So this is another instance of like, what is classy when you're rich but not when you're poor? Dealing drugs. This is this guy, like I was speaking of earlier, who these wealthy elite lawyers and bankers who fund and found all these intelligence agencies for the purpose of maintaining their interests and thwarting the communists in whatever underhanded, non-governmental ways they can, because you cannot do these things legally. Sorry, folks. Pardon me. Another odd couple. David M. Kennedy's partnership with Sindona appears equally puzzling. Raised on a ranch in Utah, Kennedy was a devout Mormon whose grandparents, John Kennedy and Peter Johnson, formed the Bank of Randolph. In 1951, he became president of Continental Illinois after serving 16 years as the debt manager for the Federal Reserve. Based in Chicago, Continental Illinois was the seventh largest bank in the country with billions in assets, including shares in an Opus Dei bank in Barcelona. In 1955, Kennedy became a, quote, conspicuous friend of the conservative Catholic religious order. I'm not going to look it up right now, but it does make me wonder if Continental Illinois either still exists or has just renamed into something else. And if it is renamed, I imagine it's probably like a major bank that we all have heard of and maybe even have accounts at. Probably like Bank of America or something. This friendship resulted in Kennedy's bank becoming the main channel for the Vatican's real estate and corporate investments, an arrangement that brought him in close contact to Prince Massimo Spada, the lay delegato of the IOR, and Michele Sindona, Spada's dutiful assistant. Through his connection, Kennedy emerged as one of Gladio's key agents, and Continental Illinois came to serve as a major conduit for the flow of covert CIA funds into the newly created BPF. I already forgot what BPF is. Anybody remind me in the chat? I'm sure it'll come up again later, but it doesn't really matter. Let's see. In this way, Sindona Bank served as the principal means of launching the 1967 coup d'etat in Greece, a Gladio undertaking spearheaded by a group of right-wing army officers. Is that always the case? Don't you love having your right-wing militant assets just secreted around the world so that you can conduct militant guerrilla coups like that? So this next section here is the guerrilla, but not like GUE, like the animal gorilla. So the guerrilla. Through Kennedy, Sindona developed a close friendship with Monsignor Paul Marcinkus, an up-and-coming cleric from Cicero, Illinois, the hometown of Al Capone. Known as the Gorilla, Marcinkus stood 6 feet 4 inches in his stocking feet. He was a scratch golfer, a gifted street fighter, and a lover of good bourbon, fine cigars, and young women. Marcinkus had worked closely with Kennedy in overseeing the Vatican's American investments through Continental Illinois and became a director of the bank's branch in Nassau. Okay, so of course you have to have like a branch in the Bahamas so you can like keep all these funds secret where they have like very little financial oversight for any of this stuff. Yeah, just another minute with this one. I'll switch over to Western Marxism. Within the effete and rarefied environment of the Vatican, Marcinkus was singled out to serve as Paul VI's protector. On one occasion, the guerrilla picked up the tiny pope and carried him through an overly enthusiastic crowd that threatened to trample him to death. On another, he saved the Holy Father from an attack by knife-wielding Bolivian artists by breaking the would-be assailant's arm. Sindona was instrumental in getting the guerrilla the position as head of the Vatican Bank. This position made Marcinkus a bishop, a prelate d'onore, and he was assigned as a special assistant to Cardinal Alberto de Giurio. The gruff cleric from Cicero was now responsible for more than 10,000 accounts belonging to religious orders and private Catholic dignitaries, including the Pope. Sindona's ties to the new bishop were strengthened by the fact that Marcinkus, in defiance of Canon 2335, the papal ban on Freemasonry, was a fellow Mason who had submitted to initiation on July 2nd, 1963. The guerrilla's Masonic codename was MARPA. Interesting. All very interesting stuff. So I will leave it off there. I'm going to bookmark it. And now we will switch over to Western Marxism. And again, this is by Domenico Lacerdo, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. So, along with Great Britain, Bloch tended to glorify the United States. Now, Bloch here is the person he's been talking about, who's like I believe is a French philosopher, is German, I can't remember, but either way, he's some kind of philosopher and writer that talks about politics and the events of the time after World War II, and of course, glorifies the United States and Great Britain, and speaks of their interpretations and what do you call it, like their praxis as far as Marxism, like their actions, as if they are the true internationalist working order, and then totally disregards the Eastern versions in China and Russia. Along with Great Britain, Bloch tended to glorify the United States. These are the years in which, without renouncing its own colonies, the Philippines, or the Monroe Doctrine, and its neocolonial control of Latin America, the North American Republic, under Woodrow Wilson, sought to give itself an anti-colonialist image, waving the banner of the self-determination of peoples. Bloch joined this campaign enthusiastically, so he took no account of the colonies, the semi-colonies, or the treatment reserved for the peoples of colonial origin by the persistent regime of white supremacy, particularly black people. And this is also great. This is like what people do when they start talking about democracy in the West. It's precisely what, I can't remember if it's the Lenin or Stalin quote, but they say, democracy remains much like democracy in ancient Greece. Democracy for the people other than the slaves. Democracy with slavery. Now let's look at Ho Chi Minh. Seeking work after having arrived in the United States in 1924, he was a horrified witness to a lynching. The slow, interminable torture of a black man was attended by a festive and cheerful crowd of whites. Yeah, this is in 1924. This is 100 years ago. This is not that long ago. Let's look at some of the particulars to better focus on the political conclusion. Quote, while on the ground, stinking of fat and smoke, a black head, mutilated, roasted, deformed, grins horribly and seems to ask the setting sun, is this civilization? And so, beyond the colonial peoples, likewise suffering oppression, humiliation, and dehumanization, are those, despite being citizens of the country that celebrates itself as the oldest democracy in the world, whose skin color betrayed their outsiderhood with respect to a self-styled superior race. The young Indo-Chinese, whose choice of being a revolutionary and a communist had matured, denounced the infamy of the white supremacist regime and the Ku Klux Klan in the International Correspondence, the French version of the organ of the Communist International. Reflections on the treatment reserved for African Americans must have played a role in the development of Mao Zedong as well. According to an authoritative witness, quote, he knew something about the Negro question in America and unfavorably compared the treatment of Negroes and American Indians with policies in the Soviet Union toward national minorities. He was interested when I pointed out great differences in the historical background of the Negro in America and that of minorities in Russia. In the West and in the development of Western Marxism, Lenin's writings denouncing the carnage of the war and the total mobilization and regimentation resonated particularly strongly. In the East and in the development of Eastern Marxism, it was his targeting of imperialism and the pretensions of the presumed, quote, elect nations or model nations that dominated and robbed the rest of the world. We are in the presence of two struggles for recognition. As far as the colonies are concerned, this is evident from Ho Chi Minh's analysis of their dehumanization. The colonial peoples were reduced to, quote, human material, or to black and yellow meat to be sacrificed in more or less enslaved labor, or by being immolated in a war in which they face thousands of kilometers away from home, people whose rulers were in mortal competition among themselves. Yeah. And that's there's a lot there that they're describing. Basically, the idea that like countries like the U.S. would hold themselves up as these shining beacons on a hill, like as if they were the beacons of freedom, the examples for the rest of the world to emulate, and here they are lynching people. And then Ho Chi Minh witnesses this. And yeah, this is not lost on the people in the East. Like, so much of the Western interpretation of world events and politics also relies on thinking that people in the rest of the world are not as valuable and therefore cannot interpret the actions and events that the West and the US are doing and committing and perpetrating on the rest of the world as what they are. And people think that just because they are as propagandized as they are in the West, that other people in the rest of the world believe that. And that's where the myth of like the Russian propaganda comes in. A more careful analysis of the demand for recognition emerges from the struggle by the popular masses in the West against the First World War. Italy was dragged into the conflict, notwithstanding the opposition of the great mass of Catholics and socialists, and when by that point it was clear to all the enormous price of human by and when by that point it was clear to all the enormous price of human life that was to be paid. I thought that was going to go on. I read that wrong. Sorry. Uh, Notwithstanding the opposition of the great mass of Catholics and socialists, and when by that point it was clear to all the enormous price of human life that was to be paid. Sorry. We can understand, therefore, Gramsci's conclusion, treated throughout history as the equivalent of a multitude of children, and therefore considered incapable of understanding and making demands at the level of politics. The popular masses could be calmly sacrificed by the dominant class on the altar of its imperial projects. And so, as it happens, the quote, working people didn't remain in the condition of a quote, good prey for all, and of simple quote, human material available to the elites, of quote, raw material for the history of the privileged classes. Yeah, that's also very eloquent ways to put it. Like the elites literally do see us as expendable, as tools for their use, just like any of the machines or anything else they would avail themselves of. There should not be any contradictions between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. We are dealing with two different perspectives on the same social system, each taking off from Lenin's analyses. In other words, two struggles for recognition called into question imperialism and capitalism. In the first, the protagonists were entire nations seeking to free themselves from the yoke of oppression, humiliation, and the dehumanization inherent in colonial domination. In the second, the protagonists were the working class and the popular masses, who refused to be the quote, raw material available to the elites. However, unity and reciprocal recognition between these two struggles could not be taken for granted from the start. Yeah, that's a great way to put that as well. It's like you can have people in the West understanding that they are exploited and also simultaneously understanding that they are not as exploited as the people who work in the sweatshops, and they still don't behave in a way that shows that their struggles are united. So now we're on to part two, socialism versus capitalism, or anti-colonialism versus colonialism. It says, section one, from the only proletarian revolution to the anti-colonial revolution. We have seen how different socioeconomic contexts and varying cultural traditions contributed to bifurcating the Marxisms in the West and the East. Now we must analyze the influence on this process exercised by the international situation's rapid transformation and the ever greater discrepancy between the initial hopes raised by the October Revolution and successive historical developments. The indignation over the First World War spread a firm conviction among European communists. On the order of the day was the overthrow of the socio-political system responsible for the horrendous carnage, and there were no intermediate objectives to pursue. Everything turned on the contradiction between capitalism and socialism, or between bourgeoisie and proletariat. This was also Lenin's view. He repeatedly stated, quote, imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution. It was the, quote, highest stage of capitalism, because, with its infamies and the mass upheavals it provoked, imperialism signaled the, quote, transition from capitalism to a higher socioeconomic order. The qualitative leap that loomed just over the horizon would be of an immeasurable magnitude compared to the upheavals of past events. In January 1917, to commemorate the 12th anniversary of the Russian Revolution of 1905, Lenin concluded that the imminent Russian Revolution would be, quote, the prologue to the coming European Revolution, and could, quote, only be a proletarian revolution, and in an even more profound sense of the world, a proletarian socialist revolution also in its content, because beyond merely the participation of the masses, of the proletariat and the popular classes. The 1905 revolution was a, quote, bourgeois democratic revolution in its social content, but a proletarian revolution in its methods of struggle. It aimed to overturn the Tsarist autocracy and the feudal nobility, but not yet the capitalist bourgeoisie. However, its shock troops were constituted by the workers, the anti-capitalist class par excellence. Interesting. I don't know if that's Lenin's characterization here or if that's the author inserting that. On the immediate eve of the overthrow of the quote government of the imperialist carnage and of the conquest of power by the Bolshevik Party, the revolutionary leader reiterated that the quote great turning point of the time went well beyond Russia. It brought ever closer to the quote world proletarian revolution, the quote international socialist revolution, and the victory of internationalism. Sorry, and the victory of internationalism. Sorry. Oh yeah, it brought ever closer those things. Had a little trouble here today, guys. Sorry. I'll just pick up here. But in his more reflective moments regarding the gigantic flaring up in Europe and worldwide, Lenin began to nurture doubts about his theoretical and political program. In the summer of 1915, he characterized the world war that had broken out the year before as a quote war between the slave owners for fortifying and strengthening colonial slavery. That's actually like a fantastic way to describe all the wars that have been waged since. I can't think of any other like major wars for liberation. There have been smaller revolts, of course, but like all the major wars have been characterized that way. Quote, the peculiarity of the situation lies in that in this war, the fate of the colonies is being decided by war on the continent. This formulation suggests that the quote original situation in which the slave owners, the great colonial and imperialist powers, held the initiative would not last long. That also is another key insight, like the fact that this war for the fate of the colonies is being waged on the continent. That's I guess why World War I and World War II were so different. The slaves of the colonies would not be long in revolting. Indeed, as Lenin noted a year later, the revolt had already begun. Quote, in Singapore, the British brutally suppressed a mutiny among their Indian troops. Something similar had happened in French Annam, which is Vietnam, and in the German Cameroons. I didn't realize that Germany had colonized Cameroon. That's definitely something to get into at some point. Also, worth noting here, many people have said that like Lenin, like right up until the point of the revolution, didn't think it was about to happen. He was like writing that it was further off than right now, of course, than right that moment. And like as he was writing that, it was happening, and he had to like stop writing to go and join it. It was a process that reached Europe itself. Ireland rose against colonial domination, a domination that London restored by firing squads. This analysis reached a conclusion of startling foresight. Before the war had even broken out, Lenin indicated with precision the two epicenters of the gigantic revolutionary and national storm growing on the horizon that marked the entire 20th century. Western Europe, Asia, and Eastern Europe on the one hand, and the colonies and semi-colonies on the other. Essentially, the first would see the unleashing of Hitler's project to construct a continental colonial empire for Germany. The second would contribute decisively to the fall, at least in its classical form, of the world colonial system. One thinks of the national liberation movements in China, India, and Vietnam. We are far from the prospect of the quote only proletarian revolution and of the world proletarian revolution or of the international socialist revolution. Yeah, so I guess that's Lenin himself even saying that like we are far off from I guess the one true worldwide proletarian revolution. Correct in that, at least. Lenin himself had already become difficult to follow in his oscillations, having become conscious of the permanent and growing importance of the colonial question. Notwithstanding the victory of the October Revolution and its socialist and internationalist pathos, he encountered strong resistance among the ranks of the Marxist and communist left in Europe. Legitimate as they were, did the protest of colonial peoples and their struggles for national liberation still make sense? Didn't the gigantic conflict for world hegemony that broke out in 1914 between the opposed imperialist coalitions demonstrate the quixotic character of the oppressed nations' attempts to win their national independence? What could David do against Goliath? If, even by some miracle, they managed to win political independence, they would remain deprived of economic independence and would have continued to submit to one form or another of oppression by this or that great power. And so the real problem was to put an end, once and for all, and on a world scale, to the capitalist imperialist system. So argued, on the wave of indignation over the First World War and of enthusiasm for the October Revolution, an important strain of Western Marxists and communists, a strain that was highly active across Europe. Okay, so I guess, is this maybe the foundation of sort of like the Trotskyist idea of like any revolution or socialist project that happens only in one country and doesn't take on the entire world is not a real one, and therefore should not be supported by anyone living comfortably in the West on top of the backs of the colonized people. Lenin referred to it, writing between August and October 1916, when he reported on a position held by, quote, one left group, namely the German International Group, whose members included Mering, Liebknecht, and Luxemburg. According to them, quote, national wars are no longer possible in the era of this unbridled imperialism. Given this assumption, one can understand the disdain with which a Swiss newspaper, the Berner Tagebuch, I'm sure that's not how you pronounce that, sorry, though firmly against the war, spoke of the insurrection of 1916 in Ireland, whose protagonists were a people seeking to liberate themselves from English domination and to constitute themselves as an independent national state. It was a, quote, putsch that caused a sensation, but was politically insignificant. In the era of imperialism, it made no sense to linger over obsolete intermediate and provincial objectives, losing sight of and weakening the only struggle that mattered, overthrowing the entire world system of imperialist capitalism. So I guess they're saying just like don't even bother, like don't even consider any of the revolts that people are holding in their own countries, especially if they're nationalist in character. That's something that should just not even be considered or taken seriously. The only thing you should take seriously and consider is the one single struggle against the world hegemony of capitalism. Lenin objected strongly to this thesis, which had circulated widely among the extreme left in Germany, Switzerland, and around the West. This is a quote from him. To imagine that social revolution is conceivable without revolts by small nations in the colonies and in Europe is to repudiate social revolution. So one army lines up in one place and says, we are for socialism, and another somewhere else says, we are for imperialism. And that will be a social revolution. Only those who hold such a ridiculously pedantic view could vilify the Irish rebellion by calling it a putsch. Whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see it. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. I hate to stumble through quoting Lenin. Sorry, guys. Does this last critical observation not end by also bashing the quote only proletarian revolution we have seen Lenin call for during a moment of hopefulness? It is clear that the principal aspect of his thought for a long time was that the anti-colonial revolutions were an integral part of the era of imperialism and of the struggle against capitalism. The persistence of national oppression internationally and within countries that boasted of their democracy, for example, the oppression of African Americans, demonstrated the quote, immense significance of the national question. We understand well that this vision emerged in the first place in a country, Tsarist Russia, that had traditionally been known as a quote, prison house of peoples, where national oppression could not be ignored, and which was moreover located close to the colonial world, properly speaking. I think I parsed that last one well, but yeah, I guess even Russia at that time was just known for being an oppressive place. And it seems like no matter what changes in government or social systems they go through, the West seems to think of Russia as just some kind of authoritarian dystopian hellhole. It's almost like it's just prejudice. On the national and colonial question in the imperialist era, a differentiation was developing between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. Yeah. I mean, that's really literally what this whole book is getting at. So I'm just checking how. What's up, Shibbles? Good morning. Okay, good. I'm at 40 minutes, so I'm actually going to bookmark this one here. But yeah, the whole premise is that there is this splitting of the Eastern, successful, effective Marxism and the Western, academic, ineffective, performative, and liberal Marxism. Pretty much the whole thing we're talking about here. All right, now I'm going to switch over to the third book. So this is Peter Dale Scott's book, Drugs, Oil, and War. And this is not a very long one either. I looked, it's only about, 74 pages, and we're on page 19 already because I skipped over some of the liner notes in the beginning. So picking right back up on here. Actually, let me make this a little bigger for myself, sorry. Getting old, folks. Okay, so the CIA was comfortable in this deniable relationship with people it knew were reorganizing the post-war drug traffic in Southeast Asia. So again, this is all stuff that's tying in directly to the Gladio book. It's not quite as extensive and focused on just that one subset of operations, but it's getting more like the whole grander arc of like the U.S. government, intelligence agencies' involvement in setting up the entire drug trade and profiting off of it to conduct their clandestine operations all around the world. So again, the CIA was comfortable in this deniable relationship with people it knew were reorganizing the post-war drug traffic in Southeast Asia. The U.S. government was determined to ensure that drug trafficking networks and triads in the region remained under KMT control. Remember, that's the Kuomintang in Taiwan. Even if this meant logistic and air support to armies in post-war Burma, whose chief activity was expanding the local supply of opium. The complex legal structure of the airline CAT, known earlier as Civil Air Transport and later as Air America, was the ideal vehicle for this support. Some CAT pilots were involved in smuggling during World War II before the CIA connection. Yeah, because the CIA either didn't exist or it was called something else, called like the OSS. The acquisition of CAT was part of a larger strategy whose principal advocate was its original owner, Major General Claire L. Chennault. Chennault predicted in the late 1940s that the victory of Mao Zedong in mainland China would be followed by a massive expansion of communist influence, first Indochina and then Thailand, Malaya, Burma, and possibly even India. Knowing that the commitment of U.S. troops in response to this threat was not politically possible, Chennault proposed an alternative, using his airline as logistical support for a KMT Chinese army, strengthened by American military advisor, and it just has like a symbol. So, or maybe it means by American military advisors, could be a typo. Chennault's project, unpopular at first inside the government, was eventually forced on a reluctant Truman administration with the support of Henry Luce's Life magazine and China lobby representatives in Congress. Okay. So I guess Truman is sort of like a Kennedy in that aspect at the time. He's like resisting these intelligence agencies or reluctant for them to do their anti-communist operations, but has no choice. The Chennault Plan deserves to be recognized as the prototype of the U.S. use of drug proxies, which has survived down to the 2001 U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. This working alliance with the drug network, implemented in the 1950s in Burma, would have been dangerous enough if politically neutral. An even more dangerous milieu for conspiratorial intrigue emerged in the early 1960s as President Kennedy gradually disengaged from the goals of the KMT and the powerful China lobby, still scheming for the recovery of the Chinese mainland. Oh yeah, so we have these orgs, basically these interests that are not giving up on the idea of China becoming capitalist. They're just still committed to this idea of like overturning the Chinese Revolution, going on 20 years afterwards, or at least 15. Urged on by the growing evidence of a Chinese-Soviet split, Chiang Kai-shek in 1962 talked openly of an imminent invasion of mainland China. As discussed below, his proposal to Washington for an expanded Bay of Pigs type operation on the mainland was endorsed by Ray Klein, the former Taiwan CIA station chief, later CIA Deputy Director of Intelligence. It was backed also by Admiral Harry D. Felt, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific CINCPAC, Commander CINCPAC. Many top U.S. military leaders and the CIA were also sympathetic. One supporter who went even further was Air America board chairman and former CINCPAC Admiral Felix B. Stump, who called publicly for the defeat of communism in the Far East using tactical nuclear weapons if necessary. Man, that sounds familiar. Tactical nukes? They've been talking about these things for that long? I thought that was like a recent development that they started talking about tactical nuclear weapons. Remember, folks, that is not a thing. There are different sizes of nuclear weapons, but they're all just fucking nukes. As is often pointed out, Chang's efforts in mainland China, I guess mainland China they mean, as is often pointed out, Chang's efforts in mainland China resulted only in the killing or capture of his agents. Hell yeah, air horns for that. But KMT allies played a successful conspiratorial role with Air America, formerly Chinoo's airline CAT, in destabilizing Laos in 1960 to 64. And even more conspicuously, they succeeded with the help of CAT in building up the post-war drug traffic. Both of these roles were probably more significant in the Laotian crises than the role attributed by US intelligence at the time to the Chinese People's Republic. KMT political objectives, assets, and allies in Laos cannot be dissociated from their stake, by then considerable, in the international drug traffic. Yeah, I mean, basically, I guess it's the case that East Asia or Southeast Asia, these were the place where all the heroin was grown before it became Afghanistan. The CIA fiascos in Laos should concern us again today, as the U.S. plays the drug card in Colombia and Afghanistan. The CIA's convenience or milieu of deniability, as opposed to secure control, gave rise to many episodes in the 1960s that are still imperfectly understood, but had lasting and disastrous consequences. Those mistakes which contributed enormously to the spread of the international drug traffic are apparently being repeated today. And again, this book was written in let's see. I can never find where it's actually like published. I guess 2003. Okay. So that would make sense. He's probably talking about the looming Afghanistan invasion and then control of all the poppy fields there. The following chapters study in reverse chronology the evolution of the energies of the CIA Air America KMT complex into the current deep politics of oil and drugs in Afghanistan and Colombia. The overall picture is complex, but certain general propositions tend to prevail. One is that initially small covert operations lacking proper supervision become budget opportunities to be exploited by a number of different lobbies, from oil to herbicides. Yeah, very convenient how that works. A second proposition is that off-the-book proprietaries like Air America survive through the war scares they helped generate. In Air America's wake, there are now a number of outsourced, nominally private corporations, such as DynCorp, which serve as trainers and infrastructure for proxy U.S. assets abroad. Also, keep that in mind when, like, you have recent events like Trump and Elon Musk shutting down government departments, slashing budgets, mass layoffs and firings and everything. All of that is just getting privatized. It's not going to be any less of a force in the world. They're not going to try to do things less. They're not going to try to interfere in other countries and governments and elections. They're just going to do it through shell companies and orgs like we're describing here. All of these, lacking a regular standing budget, require continuity of U.S. intervention if they are to remain in business as adjuncts to the U.S. defense establishment. They not only need the business, but can help ensure that it happens. So yeah, it really is just like a virtuous cycle in that way. A third proposition is that where wisdom calls for moderation and excessive okay, so it's just a typo. A third proposition is that where wisdom calls for moderation, an excessive U.S. response will generate a larger budget. Okay, sorry, it's not a typo. Where wisdom calls for moderation and excessive U.S. response will generate a larger budget, excess will tend to prevail. So yeah, they're going to err on the side of like overreacting because it means more money for the defense corporations. As I quote from former U.S. Ambassador Robert White in Chapter 6 of this book, quote, "If you put over 90 cents of your foreign policy dollar into the Pentagon and the CIA, then your policy is going to emphasize a military approach and a secretive under-the-table approach to the problem. This 9-to-1 ratio becomes even greater when we compare lobbying by profit-motivated interest to that by public interest groups." Now, again, this is going back 20 years that we're talking about this, so it's not like that problem has gotten any better in the meantime. An underreported factor in the political corruption of U.S. Asian policy has been the input of money, including drug money, from foreign governments through their lobbyists and PR firms. This book will talk about cash injected into the US political system by the China lobby, allegedly drug financed, to, to back pro KMT politicians like the young Richard Nixon. As the China lobby waned in the 1960s, its place was taken by the Korea lobby, with Anna Shino, the general's young Chinese wife, playing an important role in both. To this day, money from Soon Myung Moon's Unification Church, an offspring of the KCIA and of the related Asian People's Anti-Communist League (APACL), later the World Anti-Communist League or WACL, continues to subsidize the right-wing Washington Times. hmm I'm sure that's the Epoch Times now, or at least the Epoch Times is a subsidiary of that because it sounds very similar, same agenda, same people, same groups and orgs involved. How much longer do I have on this one? Okay, so yeah, I'll do 10 more minutes on this book. Two deeper factors reinforce the continuity sketched in the preceding paragraph. One is the continuing close involvement of regular or rogue CIA officers, such as Ray Klein or Edwin Wilson, at every stage. Another, not unrelated, is the recurring allegations that the China lobby, the Unification Church, and the APACL have all derived their considerable budgets from the drug traffic. At the origins of this insidious influence, one finds the undoubted drug involvement of the CIA's airline CAT, or later Air America. Also, just like when you think of how insidious it is that like the propaganda of every Western piece of pop culture and media, uh, even official news media, is all that like drug cartels are just these evil brown people who are doing it with no permission, let alone involvement from the West. They're just doing it out of profit because they're evil, corrupt brown people in evil, corrupt brown countries that can't get a handle on maintaining democracy, stopping huge corrupt regimes of drug traffickers from operating and running their entire country. It's wild. When in reality, it is the U.S. and its intelligence agencies that started and still do maintain all of that. The white supremacy runs deep. These foreign sources lobbying for successive U.S. wars were supported by domestic Washington lobbies, such as the American Security Council, with major oil corporations as members. We also see the role of oil companies and their own ad hoc lobbying groups in lobbying directly for heightened commitments in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Colombia. Sukhoni Mobile in Vietnam, the Foreign Oil Companies Group in Afghanistan, the U.S. Colombia Business Partnership in Colombia. These ongoing lobbies undergirded the emergence of front lobbying groups whose names were less revealing of economic interest: the American Friends of Vietnam in the 1950s and 60s, the Committee for a Free Afghanistan in the 1980s. Such lobbying activities have ranged over a wide spectrum, from overt media activity to covert corruption. Oil companies do not hesitate to associate themselves publicly with the ASC and other overt lobbying groups. At the latter, at the latter deep level, sorry, at the latter deep level are detected indirect links to the funds and principles of institutions connected to the drug traffic. But in practice, the two are intertwined. Having trouble parsing that last sentence there, but whatever. I mean, I think we get the general idea. But in practice, the two are intertwined, as we shall see when we look more closely at the example of Afghanistan in the 1980s. So the next section here is a case study in policy deformation, the stingers for Afghanistan. An exemplary case of deep political boondoggle enlarging official policy is the story of how the United States in 1986 provided Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Oh man, the Mujahideen, the Afghanistan debacle, the whole fact that like the U.S. sponsored all these people to fight the Soviets, who then turned around and used those same weapons against the U.S. That was always just such a like, what do you call it? Like a favorite event and topic of my old co-host Sterling, and we wanted to do like a whole series on just that. But it's one of these things where people have had to write entire books like this about it because it's this deep parapolitical lore, hard to research, and very hard to not sound like a total crank once you start talking about it, because people are just that indoctrinated. They just do not understand how corrupt their own government and like how much they're being lied to all the time about everything. So when you start talking about it plainly, it's like you just sound like mad people. If you can even have the time and commitment to research it that deeply. That's why it's much easier for me to just like read other people's books and comment on them. So beginning in October 19, according to conventional accounts, beginning in October 1986, certain resistance groups began to receive U.S.-made Stinger missiles through the CIA arms pipeline. The Stinger was the most important of the many new weapons used in the war. By the end of 1986, it provided the Mujahideen with a credible air defense for the first time. Reports of incredible accuracy induced the Soviets to change their hitherto successful air war strategy. So yeah, they literally made the difference in their. That's the other thing is like everyone kind of takes for granted that the U.S. and its allies, so Israel, the European states, have like this air supremacy because they have like F-16s or F-35s. They have like the superiority of missiles or whatever. But that is literally why people in places like the Middle East have had to adapt and go underground. Like this is now Tuesday after Trump just like launched all these bombs. Like um, must have used bunker busters. They're still talking about and like debating what was used. Trying to bomb several nuclear facilities in Iran, immediately claiming that they had just totally destroyed these facilities, and then over the next couple of days saying, actually, no, they're fine. They still have all the capabilities. They knew we were going to do this, so they evacuated the sites. They removed the material. So that's where we're at now as of Tuesday the 24th, but still developing there. But that's all just to say, like, because air superiority, the U.S. maintains that it forces other people to operate underground. And here they were giving Stinger missiles to reverse that air superiority that the Soviets had in Afghanistan at the time. So another book claims that, quote, the CIA's most notable and important success was introducing the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, which would begin to turn the tide of the war in 1985. Forcing Soviet attack aircraft and helicopter gunships to keep to ineffective high altitudes. The first point is that it is by no means clear that the Stingers, as so often reported, turned the tide. On the contrary, a subsequent analysis of the Soviet Politburo of the Soviet Politburo records by political scientist Alan J. Cooperman convinced him that, quote, although counterintuitive and contrary to popular wisdom, it appears the U.S. counter-escalation of 1985-6 was largely irrelevant to the Soviet withdrawal decision of November 1986. This is clearly the case for the Stinger, which was not utilized in Afghanistan until September 1986, a mere 2 months before the Politburo's decision to adopt a withdrawal deadline. At the key November 1986 Politburo meeting, no mention was made of the Stinger, nor any other U.S. escalation. Okay, so interesting. So everything I just thought that I was reading about the Stinger having changed the tide, like what I was just saying, apparently not the case. Furthermore, the program to supply Stingers, so often touted as a successful policy, became an acute problem of blowback. Check out that podcast series, highly recommend. As critics had warned, the Stingers soon fell into the wrong hands. Quote, in the fall of 1986, for example, Soviet commandos ambushed a group of rebels and captured 2 Stingers. In June 1987, Iranian Revolutionary Guards either seized or brought at least 16 Stinger missiles from the Afghan rebel forces of Yunus Khalis. One of the Stingers and the launcher turned up in the fall of 1987 on an Iranian speedboat that was captured after it fired on American Navy helicopter gunships in the Persian Gulf. Wow. That's very funny. Okay, so yeah, I also hadn't even considered. Of course, they could just buy these weapons from them. Why would you not? I imagine like a lot of this will be coming up in Ukraine in the next couple decades. The CIA in 1989 to 90 had to allocate millions in a desperate attempt, only minimally successful, to buy the unused Stingers. Wow. Fearing that the Taliban might possess as many as 300 of them. So fear that the Taliban might possess as many as 300 of them was the reason that the United States in 2001 initially conducted its air war in Afghanistan from such high altitudes. Wow, okay. So yeah, when they started invading, they were like, yeah, they might still have these. We don't know. The leading impetus to supply the Stingers did not come from the CIA, as many accounts assert, but from members of Congress and their staffs, with lobbies behind them. The army was bitterly opposed, fearing that the state of the art weapon might fall into Soviet hands, yes, of course, and be copied. Oh, also true, yeah. The CIA, quote, warned that supplying the Mujahideen with stingers might provoke Soviet retaliation against Pakistan, the base for CIA's rebel support effort. Or the base for the CIA's rebel support effort, yeah. Wow. Yeah, what a tangled web you weave when you start arming different groups and funding all these quote unquote revolutionaries because you're trying to stop the communists. She will say, who knew capitalists could be bought out? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all very interesting stuff. All right, well, I'm at an hour for today, so I'm going to bookmark this one here. Uh, Leaving off with, although other senators and congressmen were involved, the key instigator was a Democrat, Representative Charles Wilson, associated with the American Security Council. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Right, so I'll bookmark this one here. Once again, the link is in the description. If you go to youtube.com/@tcotepod/streams, in the description for all the videos is the link to the Google Docs for all of these things that I'm reading. You can read along, you can read ahead, you can comment on them, I believe. You can share them to others if you want them to find all this parapolitical knowledge and seemingly kooky conspiracy stuff that is actually just fact. It's simply just facts that the CIA has admitted to or that have been declassified over the years that people just don't care about because that is the method of doing these dastardly things. You do crazy conspiracy stuff. You call people nuts if they hint that it might be happening when it's pretty obvious the motivations of these groups during world events. And then decades later, when no one cares anymore, and you're still doing similar things, you release all the documents, and then you still call people crazy conspiracy theorists when they suggest you're doing the exact same things that the documents say you were doing years ago when all the interests are still aligned in the same way. It's essentially how it works, folks. It's fun stuff. All right, but once again, thank you all for joining. Look for the links in the descriptions, share with your friends. Hopefully I'll start releasing these on the podcast feed soon. I'm debating whether to edit them or just put them out as is. I will see. Thanks for joining.